Hey everyone, Frank here for Geekery Collective, and welcome back to part 2 of our mini-series on the Zelda timeline. This next segment, I'm coming back to my comment I made earlier during the first video. I'm going to be talking about 2 games in particular whose placement in the official timeline I believe to be inaccurate altogether. In the Hyrule Historia, Zelda 1 and 2 are placed at the very end of the Heroes Defeated timeline, or as I'm calling it, the Heroes Absent timeline. But I believe there's greater evidence to suggest these 2 games fit better elsewhere, and here's why. Let's look at Zelda 1.
The land is void of any real civilization. The handful of people that can be found are scattered among caves. All 9 dungeons are underground, and only 5 of those dungeons feature above-ground entrances and ruin. The other 4 don't have an actual entrance. Now on the Hero is Defeated timeline, it would appear the last time we were in Hyrule, prior to Zelda 1 and 2, is during A Link to the Past. But if we consider the games released since the Historia was published, the last time was actually Link Between Worlds. But the question still stands, in the time between those games and Zelda 1, how could things have gone so badly for Hyrule to the point that just there is no kingdom in that region anymore? Instead, let's consider another direction for the narrative. At the end of Wind Waker, we see Link and Zelda, Tetra, face off against Ganondorf at the top of his tower in Old Hyrule. When Ganon has seemingly bested the 2 heroes, he then reassembles the 3 Triforce pieces whole. The complete Triforce descends down, and just before Ganondorf is able to lay his hands upon the sacred relic to make his wish, the King of Hyrule touches it and wishes that this ancient land of Hyrule be washed away. The Triforce obeys the king's wish, and we then see water pour from openings out of the Great Sea above them. Before Hyrule is engulfed by water though, Link and Zelda collect themselves and battle Ganondorf for the last time. Link deals the final blow by stabbing the Master Sword into Ganondorf's forehead, causing the King of Evil to turn to stone. The struggle against evil finally coming to an end, Link and Zelda plead with the king to come with them in search of a new land. But alas, the king informs them that this new land will be their land. Our heroes are then forced to part ways with the king as the last influx of water floods in and carries them away to the surface. The king remains footed atop the tower with his kingdom of old.
A very dismal story for the Kingdom of Hyrule if you think about it. A once great and prosperous land now in ruin. Cast into a series of events causing one of its kings to wish a flood would just wash it all away. Kind of pitiful considering Link and Zelda from Ocarina fought so hard to protect their kingdom. But let's connect all this to Zelda 1, okay?
After the waters had receded or dried up, we are revealed a Hyrule with any remaining buildings or dungeons having been eroded or destroyed and buried underneath the sediment, explaining why there are no towns or buildings besides ruined entrances to underground dungeons. Next, let's connect this to Zelda 2. Now, we know for a fact that Zelda 2 is a continuation of Zelda 1. We're following the same Link as Zelda 1, only he's older now. In Zelda 2, you actually go back and trek through the stretch of land from Zelda 1, Old Hyrule, but at a much smaller scale to the rest of the overworld. Keep in mind, the land of Zelda 2 was huge for its time, but if the designers wanted to include the Hyrule from the previous game, they had to scale it down and only keep the defining features such as Death Mountain Range, the cemetery, the giant lake in the center, the Lost Woods, the forest pond to the east, and the beaches surrounding the southernmost and easternmost parts of Hyrule. Also, while we're on the topic of Hyrule's geography, if you were asked to line up the map of Ocarina, A Link to the Past, Twilight Princess with the map of Zelda 2, you wouldn't be able to fit any of those maps across all the terrain in Zelda 2. You'd be confined to that same small section of Hyrule from Zelda 1 that got scaled down to fit in Zelda 2's overworld. Lastly, and this is perhaps the most obvious piece of evidence I can think of, the towns in the north share the names of the sages from Ocarina. The towns of Saria, Darumnia, Ruto, Raru, and importantly, Naburu. So what does this mean? Well, it seems very clearly to me that Zelda 1 and 2 are actually better suited as the very last entry in the adult timeline, after Spirit Tracks. It's already evident that Old Hyrule is no more thanks to the King's Wish. The land of Zelda 1 is clearly the same kingdom of Hyrule we'd seen throughout the rest of the series, only now there is no kingdom, because it was washed away by a former king. Link and Tetra later founded a new Hyrule which we explore in Spirit Tracks. I don't think they went very far though, as it seems to me they only went north. This northern kingdom that dominates the world in Zelda 2 is what I believe to be the same kingdom Link and Tetra had founded, New Hyrule. And if you look at the world map of Zelda 2, it makes sense that there'd be towns named after the only prominent figures left in Hyrule's history, the sages. And who else would even be knowledgeable of such information but Tetra herself? She had scrolls around her quarters on her ship about the Hero of Time. Her mother must have taught her something about the Kingdom of Old. If not her mother, then she'd better know something about the sages, especially after being cooped up in Hyrule Castle surrounded by stained glass paintings of them, for God's sake. She's the only survivor to know any shred of Hyrule's history. So let's go back and look at the events behind the Hero is Absent timeline. In Ocarina, the first time Link goes back, he didn't awaken all the sages needed to seal Ganondorf. He left them behind, resulting in king-appointed sages and a link to the past. Therefore, the sages that Ocarina Link had awakened and left behind didn't do anything. At least nothing is remarkable enough in history to be remembered long after the fact and have towns of New Hyrule be named after them. Besides that, the last sage Link needed to awaken was Nabooru, and she's only awakened in the Wind Waker timeline, and she gets a town named after her in Zelda 2.
Next, I'd like to touch base on the story from Zelda 2. If you actually go back and read the story from the manual, as well as the segment in Hyrule Historia, it's all very nonsensical in relation to the rest of the timeline. In a nutshell,
a former king of Hyrule ruled with the Triforce, but he didn't think his son was worthy of inheriting the full Triforce. So before he died, the king sealed the Triforce of Courage away in the Great Palace, and the prince inherited only power and wisdom instead. The king told only his daughter, Princess Zelda, about this, and when confronted by the prince and his wizard about it, Zelda wouldn't budge. So in a fit of rage, the wizard cast a spell on her to sleep for eternity, accidentally killing himself as a result. Remorseful of what's happened to his sister, the prince, who's now king by this point, orders all daughters of royalty be named Zelda in remembrance of his sister, Zelda the First.
Now, real quick, we're going to just sidestep and pretend these two games are still occurring at the end of the defeated timeline. The first thing that should stick out to everybody about this story is, who's the first Zelda? As far as I knew, the Zelda you say from Link's Adventure is Zelda the First, not to be confused with Zelda from the first game. They're not the same person. I mean, the story goes is that she's the princess whom all other Zeldas are named after, and this was the second Zelda game released back in '87. Oh, but then Nintendo turns around and releases Skyward Sword, presenting us with a Zelda who exists before Hyrule was ever a kingdom. So now we have two Zelda the Firsts, right? That's how I'm interpreting this. So not only do we have a Zelda who exists before the kingdom's founded, but somehow we also have a Zelda the First existing during the kingdom's rule. They can't be the same person, can they? Did Zelda from Skyward Sword have a brother we didn't know about? Is he the prince who put her to sleep forever? No, that's obviously ridiculous. Skyward Sword Zelda is put to sleep, but by her own accord. And she does eventually wake up when Demise is killed. So it's safe to say that Zelda the First and Skyward Sword Zelda aren't the same person. But it would make sense at least that her story would take place early on in the timeline, right? She is the Zelda whom all other Zeldas are named after, right? Well, get this. The official timeline has that event, the tragedy of Zelda the First, placed just before the Legend of Zelda. So, what the hell are you trying to tell me, Nintendo? That long after the Zeldas from Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Four Swords, Ocarina, A Link to the Past, Oracle Series, and A Link Between Worlds comes Princess Zelda the First, whom all other Zeldas are named after? So, okay, that clearly makes no sense. Why place her tragedy so late in the timeline? What would happen, though, if we did reorganize the tragedy of Zelda the First to be a little after Skyward Sword? I mean, that makes sense, right? She's at least Princess Zelda the First, whereas Skyward Sword Zelda wasn't really a princess of a kingdom. They say Hyrule wasn't built in a day, so that kind of resolves that little dilemma, right? Well, no, we actually run into more problems. Two things. First is, the people of Skyloft and the Isle of the Goddess land here. Now, it's heavily implied that the Sealed Temple and the aforementioned Isle of the Goddess eventually become the second Temple of Time, the one from Ocarina, due to layout similarities, among other things. So there's that. We can also deduce that where the people landed on the surface is the general area where the kingdom is established. But here's the issue. The kingdom in Zelda 2 is way up here, past the landscape of traditional Hyrule. So if we place Zelda the First's existence much earlier, that means the Hyrule she would have lived in was much more north from the one founded in Skyward Sword. That's no good. Now the second issue we face is the Triforce. At the time of Zelda the First, her father hid the Triforce of Courage away in the Great Palace. The Great Palace is on an island also very far away from the Hyrule founded in Skyward Sword. So not only would the Triforce of Courage be far away from the same region of Hyrule as Skyward Sword, Ocarina, etc., but it begs the question, How would Ganondorf have been able to claim the Triforce if one of its key parts is missing? How would anyone get a hold of the Triforce as a whole if the Triforce of Courage is locked away outside of classical Hyrule? The Triforce of Courage isn't found until Zelda 2 when Link from that game rediscovers it. This is no good either. So with all that in mind, let's consider a more likely timeline. Let's place Zelda 1 and 2 back over on the Wind Waker timeline as I've been proposing. Now, in effect, from what we learned by the prologue of Wind Waker, Hyrule experienced something of a cultural reset. The memory of the kingdom vanished, but its legend of the hero of time survived. Outside of that one sliver of a story about a hero who wore green, the rest of Hyrule's history is gone. The only significant person who still knows any portion of Hyrule's history is Tetra. She's aware of Ganon's existence, she's aware of the sages, the Triforce, etc., and then she and Link and the pirates later founded a new Hyrule. So as far as this new Hyrule's aware, there were no other Zeldas prior to New Hyrule's Princess Zelda. That's considering if she even went by Zelda and not Tetra. Unless she herself didn't go by the title or namesake, but a descendant of hers was named as such, and that princess of New Hyrule's early history had succumbed to the fate of being Zelda the First. So I hypothesize it's not that there was a Zelda the First much later in Hyrule's history, as the historian puts it, nor would there have been a Zelda the First at the very beginning of Hyrule's establishment as a kingdom, but there's actually a Zelda the First of New Hyrule after Wind Waker. Also, something else to consider, Spirit Tracks makes no mention or a glimpse of the Triforce. They might have motifs of it in decoration, but the Triforce does not play any significant role in Spirit Tracks, because the missing Triforce of Courage is locked away in a different palace elsewhere. Before I end this segment, something I think that is very important to point out is the fact that there's this King of Hyrule who ruled with the Triforce from the tragedy of Zelda I. My question is, how did the royal family come into possession of the complete Triforce? Let's touch base a little bit on the nature of the Triforce. Whoever touches it, if their heart is in balance, they get the full Triforce. So going off the revision that Zelda 1 and 2 are after Spirit Tracks, we should keep in mind that it was the king from Wind Waker who touched the Triforce at the end of the game, not Ganondorf. When Ganondorf touched the Triforce in Ocarina, since he didn't have a balanced heart, he caused the Triforce to split. But now it's the king who's touching the assembled Triforce. So was the king's heart in balance and he got the entire Triforce instead? And then the king perishes under the sea, Tetra inherits the Triforce as a whole, her son, a later king, inherits it from her, he rules the new Hyrule with the Triforce, names his daughter Zelda the First, and his son inherits only power and wisdom. That kind of ties up some loose ends with how a king ruled Hyrule with the Triforce, according to the backstory in Zelda 2. Again, I'll grant you this, I don't expect the folks at Nintendo to have foreseen every single thing from the very start, planning all of this ahead of time. But I do at least expect them to have referred to material already produced before creating Skyward Sword. I mean, how can you tell me there's a Zelda existing prior to the creation of Hyrule as a kingdom without referring to your own lore in Zelda 2 when writing Skyward Sword's script, and then placing the tragedy of Zelda the First way later in the timeline, or even considering Zelda 1 and 2 for continuity with the rest of the games when the Historia's timeline was written? Come on, Miyamoto, you're letting them invalidate pre-existing lore, dude! And that's my argument for why Zelda 1 and 2 are actually better suited as the very last entry on the adult timeline. Hey, thanks for watching part 2 of 4 of our look at the Zelda timeline as we reconsidered Zelda 1 and 2 in relation to the rest of the timeline. Watch out for part 3, and if you enjoyed this video, here are some others you might enjoy as well. And don't forget to like and subscribe.